shaping the clay to throw a cylinder. I have a nice wedged ball of clay. I'm going to just clean off my wheel a little bit and get started. So I'm going to do a wheel throwing demo, beginners, cylinders, close to real time. So the first step is to get the ball of clay attached to the wheel. So throw it on there, use some water right away, press it down, make sure that the clay is smeared together. Then I can start the process of centering. So with centering, it's all about the shape of your hands, keeping your hands very steady and creating the correct shape with your hands to make a nice centered ball of clay. So keeping your hands steady is aided by keeping your elbows in your thighs, touching my hands together when I can. And to create the shape, I'm going to manipulate the shape of my hands and see how that affects things. So a good process for centering is called coning up, where you make the clay grow up in height and then press down on the clay and make it get smaller. So if I stop halfway there, you can see that it's starting to go a little bit down, and now I'm going to press all the way down until the clay takes the shape and stops the wobbling. When the piece of clay is centered on the wheel, your hand doesn't move when it's touching the side. If the piece of clay is off center, your hand on the side is bouncing back and forth. And if you think about what's happening is the off center piece of clay is moving away, your hand can push in a little bit, and then it comes back at your hand and it pushes back at your hand. So as it's going around, your hand is moving in and out. So what you really need to do is keep your hand steady. So I'm gonna go ahead and steady my hand. That is by putting my elbow in my thigh, by putting my other hand in front of it, pressing together, pushing against the clay, having the clay touch the interior part of my hand much more than my fingertips. So that's a thing for beginners, is wrapping your hands around the clay, and that causes the wrong shape of your hand. So you want to open your fingers up, make sure that you're using the palms of your hand when you're centering. My left hand's my dominant hand, that's pretty much staying where it is. My right hand is able to manipulate the clay a little bit more. So there we go. Now we're going to open the interior of the pot, just pressing down with my thumbs. Once I get a little bit of friction, I'm going to add a drip of water, and I'm pressing down until I have the correct thickness there, and I can judge that based on look of the thickness of where the clay is and where the bat is, the wheel head rather. So I can test that by putting the needle tool through till the bottom of the clay, keep my finger there and pull that out, and then I can read that thickness, which is just about a 1/4 of an inch, which is what we want for the mug that we're making. So I'm going to go ahead and open the outside bottom now. So this is all about steady, steady, steady. So when I have my hands, what I just did there was my middle fingers on my right hand pulling the interior bottom and opening that wall, and my right hand, I'm keeping my hands the same so that I can describe this. My right hand, my whole finger was up in my left hand there. These pointer, my middle and my ring finger and my pinky finger are all side by side to give myself some extra strength. And I use my interior fingers and I pulled them towards my outside hand, which is again in my thighs. My two hands are touching together. Now I'm going to compress and flatten the interior bottom. So starting in the center and heading towards the outside. And what I'm really trying to do is press into that angle right in the corner where the base meets the wall, and make sure that I don't have, if you have a curve there, then that's where extra clay is going to hide. And I'm going to go back and forth from the outside to the inside as many times as I feel like I need to make that nice and flat and compressed in the bottom, and have a nice angle right there on the inside where I can grab onto the clay. So before I do the first pull, I'm going to get the shape back, what I centered, and now I'm going to go and do the first pull. So I'm going to use my sponge in my outside hand over here, and my fingers on the inside, and I'm just going to pull. This first pull is really getting rid of the hump that's on the inside. When I push the clay back together, it does what I have here, which is this shape where there's a lump of clay on the inside. So that first pull, what I just did is putting my finger into this corner here and then just pulling up so that I flatten that out and get to a look that's something like this. So now my cylinder is starting to be pulled, the walls are thicker than they want to be, and now the next couple pulls are going to be to get us to this shape here. So I'll go back. After that first pull, I'm going to use my sponge, compress the lip. I want to do that after every pull if I can remember. Compressing the lip is just a matter of putting your sponge on top and rounding it again. So I'm pressing again. Now I have my sponge in my outside hand. I'm pressing in on the bottom. I'm doing it on the back side of the pot here. So to show you from this side, I'm pressing in on the bottom and creating this little lump that you can see right there. And then my fingers on the inside, the entirety of my middle finger is touching the inside of the pot, which gives me some more stability as I'm pulling. So now I'm going to pinch together, and I am using my fingertips essentially, but in reality my inside finger is touching the pot in a couple different places. If I keep the clay on my hand, you can see on my middle finger there how it goes up the side. I also had it touching on this finger on the inside, and then on the outside I was pushing in with my fingertips on the outside of the sponge, and my thumb on the backside was capturing some of this clay. So actually the force of pushing it in there kind of ripped some of this clay off. So I want to keep my hands very steady when stuff like that is happening, when the clay is ripping off. If there's wobbling happening, the only things I can control is what is directly in between my fingers as far as the clay goes. So if it's wobbling down here, I can't fix that until I get back down to it. So that was the second pull. I compressed the lip already. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go in, open this up, widen it a little bit so I can get my hand in there. And now for this third pull, I'm really assessing where there's extra thickness, and I can tell that the bottom half an inch or so is really where it is. So I'm going to make sure that I press extra hard right at the bottom and compress that clay together. Now that I've got my fingers together, I'm going to pull up. Now that I'm about a third of the way up, getting towards half, I'm releasing the pressure of my fingers. So I'm not really pressing the clay together anymore, but I'm following the pull all the way through to the top. I'm going to compress the lip again, and now I'll go ahead and do one more pull. So I'm going to get some water on the inside by dripping it down my finger so that it actually gets on the inside wall and doesn't just pile up in the bottom. Now I'm letting this spin many times before I start the pull, just to kind of help get it back on center. Steady, 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 and I can get a wobbly pot mostly back on center. Finishing the motion of the pull from the bottom to the top is really key. And what I have here is from inconsistent pressure, I have a wobbly lip, I have a bouncing lip, and that's where the needle tool comes into play. So I can trim this lip very easily by using the needle tool. I'm going to hold it in the entirety of my left hand so that I'm really holding onto the tool very tightly, and then using my right hand finger on the inside. As the clay spins multiple times, I'm going to cut through, and now it's touched my finger and spun all the way around, and then I can lift up and off. So if you look on the top of the top of the cylinder, as the needle is cutting through, my finger's on the inside, but as it's cutting through, it's spinning maybe 4 or 5 or 6 times. So the problems that you can have are when you try to cut through too much at once. So now, especially after I've trimmed the lip, I want to make sure that I can press it and just get a nice shape into that. So I'm going to compress that a little bit, press that back down in there. And now I'm going to go back and do the final pull and shaping of this straight-walled cylinder. So just not even really a pull, just kind of pressing into that bottom to get some of that clay going up a little bit. Now I'm going to rely on the shape of my wooden rib, and I like to use this side of this particular rib. It's got a straight edge here with this little curve that gives some forgiveness if I need to move the rib. If I use this side, I don't have that forgiveness, and if I move the rib, then the top corner is going to dig into it a little bit. So I like to use this, and I'm going to use it essentially like this, right on the side. I'm going to bring it right down to the bottom and bring it up to the edge, but I'm going to do it over here where you can't really see it, unfortunately, from where the camera is. But while I do that, press in from the outside, I'm going to be pressing out from the inside with the entirety of my pointer finger essentially is going to be riding on the inside of this cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'll try to do it towards the back a little bit. I'm going to do this here. So pressing in from the outside, and that's what I'm relying on for creating the shape. The inside pressure is just pressing against the rib a little bit, trying not to make things go too wonky. In fact, the opposite. The rigidity of this rib is going to help me shape the pot. It also removes this very wet clay, this slurry from the outside of the pot, so that what's left behind is the stronger, drier clay. So now what we've done is the lip of the pot and the body of the pot, and the final thing to do before we finish up is the foot of the pot. So with a cylinder, you're probably going to be trimming your cylinders or your vases or whatever you're making. So what you want to do is make sure that the diameter on the bottom is nice and clean for your wire to get underneath, and when you turn it over to trim it when it's leather hard. So at the very least in the beginning, I would say you want to take your needle tool and touch it to the bat, or touch it to the wheel head and bring it underneath and just cut under to sort of reintroduce the shadow that you get rid of in the very first part of throwing. So now I have a place for my wire tool to come underneath and remove the pot for trimming. I'm gonna just compress the lip a little bit more and do one more. I'm just kind of pressing together down at the bottom. Maybe one more pull, I guess. Didn't need to do this, but it looked a little stout when I was looking at it. So now we'll see. I'm gonna cut it open. So for this demo cylinder, and if you're just practicing, highly recommend cutting your pieces open, looking at the cross section. Taking in that cross section visually really helps you imagine it in the future when you're going to trim your pieces. So to cut it in half, I'm just going to pull directly under, halfway, stop and straighten out the wire, and now I'm going to pull directly up and pull this away, and you can see then what's going on with the cylinder. So taking a look here, the walls are fairly consistent from the bottom to the top. That's a good consistent thickness. It didn't get too thin, which sometimes tends to happen at the top of the pot, especially when you're throwing something with significant height. But when you start to think about keeping your pieces and trimming them, the clay that you're going to trim away is here at the bottom. So even if we didn't really add a foot to this, but we just trimmed away all of this clay on the excess there, and of course you have a mirror image over here because it's happening while the wheel is spinning, so not quite a mirror image, but and remove all of that. So we could at least take away all that extra weight that if you're using this as a drinking vessel or something is really key to remove. Now as you get more and more practice with throwing, you can get rid of more of that clay in the wet stage, but trimming is an important part of the process and not something to look at as something you have to do if you can't throw it. It's an important part of the process, and it should be taught from the beginning stages as something that's something that you need to do. You could, if you have enough thickness on the bottom, you could trim a foot into there and actually remove some of this clay in between where the foot stands, so you could glaze the interior bottom. So there's a fairly quick cylinder. I'm going to change the camera angle and on the same video do a real-time cylinder without much explanation. Stuck to the wheel. Start centering by getting it really well stuck. On the center, I'm going to cone up a couple times. That's one. Another. Just my rib to remove some of this clay on the bottom. Clay. Splash a little water on there, open it up. A little more water, open the interior bottom. I'm going to compress the interior bottom. Make sure it's nice and flat to help against cracking. Consistent drying. Compress it back towards the shape that I had when I centered it. Go for my first pull, moving the clay that's on the inside up to even it out a bit. Now compress the top right away. Go back down to the bottom, grab some clay from the outside in this case, pressing my hands together. Pull it up. Pull number 2, compress the lip. One more water, just splash some water on the inside so I can get my hand in there. And I'm going to go down to the bottom, try to grab some clay from the inside and the outside, because I have extra clay at the bottom, not so much at the top. So now that I'm about 2/3 halfway up, I can feel the clay. That lump of clay is evened out. Now I'm in the top, which doesn't need to be thinned anymore, so I'm going to release pressure and continue the pull, the direction of the pull all the way up the wall. Got a little bit of water on the inside, so I'm going to use my sponge and just sop that up. I want to get that water out of there. If you let water sit on the inside, it degrades the strength of your pot. Get back for another pull here. Most of my clay I feel is in the inside, so I'm pressing more from the inside on this one, a bit from the outside, however. And now going really slow up this while the wheel spins. Clay can only be affected as it spins right through my fingertips, so I want to make sure that it goes around at least one full revolution before I move my fingers up too much. And now we're feeling thinned out enough, but a little misshapen. We're going for a straight-walled cylinder in this case. So I'm going to rely on the rib to help me with that. Press out from the inside to make the clay match the rib, out to the rib. Now I'm pressing in from the outside with the rib, holding onto a very steady elbow in my thigh. My right elbow is floating, so I'm keeping that really steady, partially by thinking about it. And continue the direction of the pull with the rib to straighten the side. Now I'll trim the lip just to even it out a little bit, get rid of that little bit of bounce that's there, and also get some more practice with that. So hold the needle tool very tightly, my right middle finger on the inside. It's going to rotate while I cut through 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and then pull up and off once it's cut all the way through. So again, as that's cutting through, the clay is rotating multiple times, and that helps to deform it less and give you more successful trim off the top. Now I'm going to compress the lip, just round that together, and go down to the bottom now for the foot. I'm just going to cut in a little bit. It's going to help me remove some of this clay. I'm going to press my finger in above my wood tool, and I'll create this sort of fake foot, faux foot shape on the bottom. If you were in production pottery training, you might use a foot tool, something to shape the outside so that you don't have to trim it when it's leather hard, because you're thinking about the price per piece. But if you're learning how to do this as a craft, I would encourage you to consider trimming all of your pieces. It's an important part of the throwing process. It's not something to be done just if you can't throw something wet. A little sort of pull as the last step there. I've gotten into that process. This is the type of cylinder that could be used for a drinking vessel. So I'll go ahead and cut it in half so you can see what it looks like. Pull directly under, straight up, and then pull that away, and you can see the wall. So fairly consistent from the top to the bottom. There is enough clay here on this bottom foot that I would want to, even though I've trimmed that away a little bit wet, I would want to, when it's leather hard, trim it away a little bit more, and maybe even put a foot into this. And if you think about this as a drinking vessel, it's going to be turned over all the time. It's going to be washed. People see the bottom when you're drinking out of it. So it's another reason to encourage the trimming of pieces, even when it's just a mug or something like that, because people are going to see the bottom. So